Welcome back to Personal History. I'm your host, Matt Staley. In this episode titled The Big Mission, we switch locations and time frames and move into World War II in late 1944 in southern France. This involves a particular mission for a P-47 squadron. The story is told by Lieutenant, later Lieutenant Colonel, Ross Soap, and involves my great-uncle Dan Staley. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy videos like this, please like and subscribe. Thanks again.
One, two, three, and starting.
So some background before we get into the actual story. The story features a fighter-bomber squadron that was based in southern France during Operation Dragoon, which was the invasion of southern France in late 1944. This squadron was flying the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was a heavy fighter originally designed as a long-range bomber escort, but as the war went on, the P-51 Mustang increasingly replaced it in that role, and it was moved into ground support that it was extremely well suited for. The Thunderbolt was extremely durable, could take a lot of damage, and still keep on flying, and was very heavily armed. It had 450 caliber machine guns in each wing, by far the most heavily armed single-seat fighter the U.S. had during World War II, and could also carry up to 2,500 pounds of rockets and bombs. So as the war went on, it was increasingly used for close air support and what they would call hunting for targets of opportunity, where they would send them out to look for German forces that were on the move during the day and then attack them as they found them. So in this story, it features later model Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. These were D models, where the fuselage had been chopped down and the old framed canopy had been replaced by a plexiglass, what they called teardrop canopy, that allowed the pilots to see completely around them. So with that little bit of background, we'll go ahead and get into the story. The 8 of us grumbled, cursed softly as not to waken others in our tents, or made no sounds at all, depending on the different dispositions of those involved, as we were aroused from our sleep in the pre-dawn darkness of August 28th, 1944. After sloshing cold water on our faces from the helmets Uncle Sam had so thoughtfully provided us, probably one of the most important single GI articles in the entire Air Force, we made our sleepy way to the mess tent for a tasty breakfast of powdered eggs and soppy toast covered with a liberal smearing of orange marmalade. This behind us, we loaded onto a couple of jeeps and headed for the operations tent for a pre-flight briefing of the day's assigned activities. Today's flight was to be only my 8th mission, but already I felt like a hardened veteran. On my 4th mission, I'd been hit by flak. I think everyone knows the old saying of it only takes one time under fire to make a combat veteran of our ground soldiers, and the first close burst of flak has the same aging process for the men who fly. My baptism by fire came on my very first mission, which happened to be on D-Day in southern France on August 15th, 1944. For our base on Corsica, we had gone in ahead of the actual invasion to soften up the beach defenses and patrol the landing area, discouraging any air activity on the part of the Germans while our boys on the ground went about their business of getting established on the beachhead. The welcoming committee over the beach was not very accurate in its attempt to knock us from the skies, but when a burst of flak is close enough to fly through and get the acrid stench of burned powder in your nostrils, it's close enough to give you a pretty rough idea of how the enemy feels towards you. Those first bursts of beautiful, blossoming, deadly, gray-black flak were enough to kill any previous ambition on my part of becoming a great bemiddled hero, and left only the desire to finish this war, or at least my part of it, and head back towards Texas all in one piece and under my own power. We were now based on a bulldozed airstrip near a little town named Le Luc in southern France, and our P-47 Thunderbolts were a constant source of harassment, terror, and death to the wildly fleeing Germans as they made their way up the narrow, winding Rhone Valley towards the fatherland, and they hoped safety. By the time we reached the operations tent this morning, we were fully awake and ready to listen to the briefing officer line out our duties. Today, for a change, we were not to have a specific target to bomb or strafe as usual, but were to go on a fighter sweep, also known as an armed reconnaissance mission seeking targets of opportunity. Instead of bombs, we would carry wing tanks to give us added range, and all 850 caliber machine guns in the wings of each plane would be fully loaded to their maximum capacity to give us all possible firepower. There had recently been some instances of our planes, through mistaken identity, attacking our own forces, so the briefing officer laid particular stress on the importance of making positive identification before attacking any targets on the ground. Due to the rapid retreat of the Germans at this time, and the equally rapid advance of our own troops, it was practically impossible to keep accurate dividing lines between the two forces. The determining of targets would actually be the responsibility of the flight and element leaders of the mission, while the wingman, of which I was one, kept an eye on the sky seeking any sign of enemy aircraft. Lieutenant Daniel L. Staley of Springfield, New Jersey, was our flight leader, and I was his wingman. Lieutenant John C. Newman of Mason City, Nebraska, was element leader, and his wingman was Alexander R. Katnack from Chicago, Illinois. The second flight of 4 planes, led by Lieutenant Agnes F. Turner of Chicago, Illinois, made up the balance of our 8-plane force. After briefing, and still in the darkness of the late summer morning, we again boarded jeeps and were taken to our planes, which were dispersed near our only runway, which consisted of steel mesh lying on a graded dirt plain. My crew chief, Staff Sergeant Andrew F. Bayless of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was just finishing his final pre-flight check on my plane as I left the jeep and began buckling on my chute before climbing into the cockpit. Here was a little guy, only slightly over 5 feet in height and answering to the highly improbable nickname of Tripod, who carried my life in the palm of his oil-stained hands each time I left the ground in this plane which he managed to keep flying under very adverse conditions. Though I'd personally give the Jug a final pre-flight test, it was always good to see him grin and hear him assure me that, quote, our ship was in tip-top shape. Corporal Roger E. Keach from York, Pennsylvania, was making a final check of my guns to make certain they were fully loaded and ready to fire. After the war, Chick Keach became a minister, and I often think of the irony of a future minister of the gospel loading guns for killing his fellow man. After checking our planes thoroughly, we taxied out single file behind Lieutenant Staley, who was the first to take off. Due to the tremendous cloud of dust kicked up by his plane as it moved down the runway, it was necessary for me to wait several minutes before I eased the throttle forward to begin its takeoff run. Immediately after getting off the ground and retracting my landing gear, I started a gradual turn to the left to join Lieutenant Staley, who was steadily climbing in a loose turn. One by one, the other planes became airborne, and when the 8 of us had joined in formation, we headed northwards towards Germany in search of the enemy. Fortunately, and to our great liking, this was a cloudless day, unusual to say the least. Someone in our outfit had composed several verses, all unprintable, to the popular tune of the day, the refrain of which ran, "If the flak don't get you, the weather will." How true this was can only be attested to by those who have tried to fly formation while on instruments in what we called the soup. Shortly after crossing the bomb line and entering enemy territory, Lieutenant Staley spotted below us on a narrow 2-lane road paralleling the Rhone River a long convoy of stalled trucks, wagons, and vehicles of every imaginable description. Remembering the warnings of our briefing officer to make no mistakes as to the identity of the targets, Staley led us lower for a closer examination. Just as he satisfied himself that the convoy was German, they evidently became annoyed at our prying eyes and sent up several bursts of flak as a warning. Staley then led us off in a long, climbing turn around an isolated mountain in this area of many hills and mountains. When safely out of sight and range of our newfound playmates, he ordered us to drop our wing tanks to lessen the danger of explosion in case we were hit by enemy fire. As my released tanks went sailing out and down, I felt that tightness in the throat and uneasiness in the lower stomach which seems to be common ailments of men about to engage in mortal combat. When attacking a convoy of this type, our normal tactic was to make a series of passes across the road at treetop level, as this cuts out the time necessary for those on the ground to bring their guns to bear and return fire. However, due to the high mountains on each side of the road, this area, Staley decided to lead his flight directly down the entire length of the road and ordered Lieutenant Turner to follow with his flight of 4 afterwards. In dropping down for a closer look, we had forfeited all attempts of surprise, so when we came from behind the mountain to commence our run down the road, the Germans were waiting for us with quite a reception committee. Normally, machine guns are fired in short bursts to prevent overheating and burning out their barrels, but this time we squeezed down hard on the triggers and poured a steady stream of hot lead ahead of us as we raced through the almost solid wall of flak, small arms fire, and the ricocheting bullets from our own guns. Though the actual time of the strafing run was short, as measured on a clock, it seemed like an eternity as we were living through it, and no sane bookmaker would have taken the odds on any of us getting through this man-made cloud of smoke and hot flying fragments of metal alive. Since then, I've tried to remember what my thoughts were as men and animals fell before my guns and other men tried to bring down my machine of destruction. The only thought I clearly remember is that it was a shame to kill horses, which were part of this convoy. Oddly enough, I recall no similar feelings for the men. Several times when horses showed up in my gun sight, I took my finger off the trigger. Other men of this mission confided in me that they too had the same sort of feelings and that they also quit shooting when livestock became the target. We had no similar feelings for the men on the ground. As we neared the end of this 14-mile convoy, I saw a brilliant flash and explosion directly in front of Staley, too close for him to avoid. Apparently we had hit either a gasoline or ammunition truck which had exploded, sending flaming debris into the air higher than our planes. Staley could not avoid flying directly through the airborne wreckage, with me close behind him. A moment later, as my guns quit firing due to there being out of ammunition, I heard Lieutenant Staley on the radio. "This is next year, Red Leader. My guns are empty. Let's go home." Needless to say, those were welcome words to hear. We pulled away from the road and started climbing, but there were only 3 planes in our flight. Lieutenant Katnack, our number 4 man, was missing, and it was not until several days later that we learned his plane had been hit badly. He, however, had been able to gain enough altitude to bail out before his engine quit, and the French partisans had hit him until our troops overran the area a few days later and freed him to return to fly again. Lieutenant Turner and his flight of 4 had become separated us, but all 4 returned to base. As we gained altitude and pointed our noses homeward, Lieutenant Staley again called on his radio. "This is next year, Red Leader. I've been hurt, but I don't know how badly. Keep an eye on me." Acknowledging Staley's call, I pulled up for a closer look at his cockpit to see if I could determine his trouble. It didn't take me long to find it. Apparently, when he had flown through the flying wreckage, some large piece of it had hit the top rim of his canopy, covering the cockpit, caving it in upon his head. He was now flying in an open cockpit P-47, and one side of his face was covered by blood, but he gave me a crooked grin and a feeble wave of his hand when he looked my way and saw me up close. Talk about a helpless feeling. Here's your leader, only a few feet away, but for all the aid you can give him, he might as well be on the other side of the earth. In a fighter plane, which only has 1 occupant, a pilot pretty well has to make it on his own, or he doesn't make it at all. Lieutenant Newman, the second in command of our flight, called me. "This is next year, Red 3. Keep talking to him, Soap. I'm going to gain some altitude to contact ground control station and get a direct bearing to base. I'll have to change frequency, so keep an eye on me and follow where I lead." I acknowledged the call and immediately began a steady stream of chatter and instructions to Staley, who never answered me but seemed to understand what I was saying as he followed the directions I gave him. Occasionally his head would nod forward on his chest as though he were taking a nap, and at these times I would whistle or yell shrilly at him via the radio. Those high-pitched sounds seemed to reach his subconscious, because each time he would snap his head erect and look around dazedly as someone just awakening from a sound sleep might do. We were approaching a range of mountains, higher than the altitude which we had attained, and I was afraid Staley would be unable to get over them, as we were gaining altitude very slowly. Several valleys and saddles were visible in this range of hills, so by steering first to the right, then to the left, and again to the right, we managed to get through instead of over the range. The amazing and unbelievable thing was the way Staley followed every instruction. My hopes were rising of getting him safely home, though it was plain to see that only his subconscious reflexes were keeping him in the air. During this time, Newman had been successful in raising the ground control station, which had given him the direct bearing for the route to our base. And though several thousand feet lower, Staley and I were flying the same course homeward. Suddenly, just as my hopes had risen, Staley pulled up, did a beautiful wing over, and headed directly for the ground in a tight spiral, disappearing under the wing of my plane. I raised my steady chatter on the radio to a shrill scream, trying to catch his attention as I rolled over to follow him earthward. My mind was ready to accept the fact that I would see nothing but the flaming wreckage of his plane as I searched the ground, but I wanted to be able, if possible, to point out the spot on the map so that searching parties could later recover and bury his crushed body. Imagine my surprise, however, to discover him flying along the floor of the valley, barely above the treetops, but with his plane well again under control. When I called to him and advised that he gain more altitude, he promptly began a slow but steady climb. Soon we were, once more, at an altitude safely above the mountains. Sometime later, Newman came back on our radio frequency and said, "This is next year, Red 3. Staley, the field is directly in front of you. Drop your landing gear and make a straight-in approach. The field is cleared for your landing." Though he made no verbal acknowledgement of the call, Staley immediately dropped his landing gear and made the necessary letdown and dropped in for a fairly decent landing. As he rolled down the runway, an ambulance and fire truck took off in hot pursuit of his plane. This was standard operating procedure. Newman and I circled the field as Staley rolled to a stop, climbed from his cockpit, and collapsed on the ground beside his plane. By this time, the ambulance had reached him, and he was quickly rushed to the hospital. After his plane was moved from the runway, Newman and I landed, and as we taxied our planes to their revetments, Lieutenant Turner brought in his flight of 4, and all of us were rushed to the operations tent for interrogation of the morning's happenings. As soon as our story was told, the other flights were sent out to finish the work we had started, and before the day was over, 14 miles of the two-lane German convoy between Mont-Lamar and Valence, France, had been completely destroyed. Of the 8 planes which had started our flight, only 1 was lost. That was Lieutenant Catnack. And 6 of the remaining 7 were so badly damaged, including mine, that major repairs were necessary before they could be flown again. Only the plane flown by Lieutenant Turner, leader of the second flight, miraculously came through that deadly sea of fire and destruction without a single hit. Needless to say, every gun barrel was burned out and had to be replaced. Lieutenant Staley recovered from his injuries a short time later and flew many more missions before completing his tour of duty and returning to the States, but at the time of his leaving, he maintained that he had no memory of his flight home from this encounter.